Welcome in the Biodiversity Museum of the School of Biological Science of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Dr. Benoit Guénard and I'm an associate professor here, and I'm also the director of this museum. So it's my pleasure to welcome you here. One of the questions you might ask yourself is, what is the role of a museum? How is that important? Well, museums actually are key players for understanding of biodiversity and other change that happen to biodiversity. So I'm sure you have heard about specific problems such as deforestation, climate change, biological invasion, but also pollution. Well, by collecting samples and preserving them in a collection, we are actually able to go back in time and check what species were present where and when. We can also deposit new collection, which could be used in the future, either for taxonomic revision, which allows to describe new species, but also for doing genetic analysis. In fact, having all the specimens around me are numbers of vessels of DNA that now we are actually able to extract DNA from, even for specimens that sometimes can be decades or even hundreds of years old. So this is why having collections that include all those specimens is so important. It's also very important for teaching. Having the opportunity to really manipulate, touch, see, and sometimes even smell an organism is something very unique. It helps you to understand, to sometimes relate the theory that you can learn in the course with actually the practice, where you can observe directly those specimens and compare. Here in the following tour, you will see that we have specimens that actually look sometimes quite similar or are very different from each other. But by having them right directly under your eyes, you can take the time to compare and observe all those subtle differences. So I hope you will enjoy this tour and then follow me to see this incredible collection, unique in Hong Kong. So one of the goals with the museum is to show you organisms that you're not used to see, but also to show them to you in a way that maybe you have never seen them before. Here we have examples with ants, probably some of the most common insects that people will think about. And yet, most people, when they talk to me about ants, they tell me, well, which one is the big red or the small black? Actually, ants are very diverse. In Hong Kong, we have over 300 species of ants alone. Here, on this poster, we try to display some of this diversity that we can observe in ants. You can see that, first of all, they don't have all the same color. More than just having the red and the black one, we have some that are also orange, some that are yellow. But even more strikingly, we have some that have very large eyes, like this one here, and some that have no eyes at all. We have some that have long mandibles, like this one, and some that are very stout mandibles. So all that diversity is actually one of the missions that we have, like finding ways to present it to you in a way that you have never seen it before. Similarly, if we start looking at an honeybee or some wasp here, we can see that they have very distinctive feature. Look how furry a honeybee is, probably even more than your teddy bear. But look at this wasp here that has incredible iridescent color that you would not actually think about before you can look at one under a microscope. Today what I'm going to do is actually introduce the museum to you and explain why is it important to actually preserve such a collection of specimens for different purposes, including research, teaching, and general education to the public. So we're going to go through the different parts of the museum, as well as look at maybe some particular specimens and discuss some of their interests. But of course, we have thousands of specimens right here in the museum, so we're not going to have the time to really present every single one of them individually. But maybe that would be for you to discover them once you are joining us here at HKU. So in the first section of this museum, we do have the bird collection, and in particular the birds that are taxidermist, meaning that the way they are presented is actually the way that you will find them in nature, with the feather and the posture that they might have actually in nature. As we continue through the museum, you will actually find different kinds of structure for the birds as well that we preserve. We do have some of the eggs, a collection of eggs of different species of birds that are being found, as well as a few nests that are being built by the birds. So potentially, if you find some bird nests that are abandoned, like on the ground, you can actually try to keep them and preserve them and maybe bring them in the museum if you want to participate to the collection. Then, as we continue through the museum, we're actually transitioning now to the mammals. And in the mammals, again, we have the specimens that are taxidermied, so you will see them with the fur and in some position that they might actually have naturally. And then as we go further, we will find more and more specimens. Here we have the rodents, we have some primates here, for instance. We also have some species of conservation that are important to focus on. So here we do have some pangolin, for instance. Again, we have another section here with a few more mammals being presented. So we do have some beaver, for instance, here, as well as some bandicoot. So species of mammals or birds, as we've seen before, they are really coming from many different parts of the world, as well as some local species found in Hong Kong. So we have a couple more of species of mammals that are presented here with a fox and a rabbit. And you can see here those are actually probably not from Hong Kong, but more from European countries. Okay, so on this part we do have a collection of smaller mammals that are actually maintained in some preservative liquid, which allow to keep them again for hundreds of years. They're not that old, but they could be maintained for a very long time if they are preserved properly. And you can see here that we have some opossum, some bats, some marmoset, as well as quite a few rodents being present in the collection. So the previous specimens we've seen actually are showing us the external morphology of the different organisms that we can be interested. But we might also be interested in the internal morphology, so looking at the bones in particular. And so in this case, you can see here that we have numerous bones or skeleton present for diverse mammal groups. And so that really helps us to understand the evolution and the diversity that we can retrieve within the mammal, for instance, but also, as we will see later, in some other groups such as the reptiles, the birds, and etc. So here's some of the rest of the collection of the skulls as well that we have. So we have species that are much larger. You can see a horse skull, for example, which obviously is much larger than what we've seen for the rodents or even some of the deer that we have. And you also have some wild boar and pigs, and we're going to see in the next section that we have even larger animals being found here in the museum. So here we have actually skulls of three interesting organisms. You can see on the left that we have the skull of a dolphin, so that very long nose, like full of different teeth. We do have the skull of a walrus with some very prominent teeth. And then we have the skull of a camel, which is also quite large considering the size of the organism. Here we have two skulls that are even larger than the one we observed before. We have the skull here on the top of a rhinoceros, and in the bottom we have the skull of a buffalo with very two prominent horns. I am myself over 2 meters tall, so sometimes people refer to me as a giant. But here we actually have true giant of the natural world. We have a giraffe in the bottom part, an elephant in the middle part here, and an hippopotamus on the top part. So you can see that those skulls are very massive, and if you try to actually carry them yourself, they will weigh like several dozens of kilos, so they are very hard to actually move around. In the elephant here, the skull is actually not the one of an adult, but just of a juvenile, so you can imagine how large they become when they get adult. We're going to see later on some of the teeth as well of a single individual, and those are pretty massive. We do have many specimens that are also preserved in their entirety, so you can see the full skeleton and look at the articulation of those different bones with one another. This is one of my favorite ones. This is actually the skeleton of a gibbon, and what I really like about it is not so much that it's a gibbon, but it's more the way that he has been preserved. So what you can see is that the specimen is actually hanging from a branch, so it's really like in the most natural position that the gibbon will experience during its lifetime. Locomotion is very important for many organisms, where they need to actually move from one place to another to find food, to find mate, to find shelters. Here what we can see is actually just the foot or the legs of some of those organisms. And so you can see in this, here we have an hippopotamus with very large foot, and you can see the complexity of all those different bones all together. Here, this is the femur of a young elephant, and you can already see the size of that single bone that I have in my hands. So here we have now the reptile collection. And what you can see on the top here are actually some of the crocodilians that we can find. So for instance, we have also a collection of skulls. And here I'm just going to take this one, which is a caiman. And we can see the structure both underneath the skull as well as on the side and as on the top. So really when we study them, we can really manipulate them and really look at all the different components that actually are forming the skull. So here we have more turtles that are being presented, and you can see that on the top we have some marine turtles that are actually taxidermies, so the whole specimen is being preserved. And if you pay attention here to the eye, there is something very strange about it. In fact, the eye is replaced by a marble. So the person who actually preserved this specimen probably did not have the exact replicate of an eye of a turtle, so instead decided to just maybe go by and use one of the marble that kids usually are using. So that's kind of for the anecdote, we can pay attention to that one. But more seriously, what we can also realize is that there are only certain structure of the body that we can preserve when we keep a specimen like that. And the eyes, being some kind of a fleshy structure, actually will decompose, so it's not possible to keep it, contrary to the skin that can actually be preserved, or the bones, or even some of the fur, what we've seen with the mammals. On the bottom part, you can see that the specimens here again are actually preserved in some kind of preservative liquid. So that allows us to preserve, especially for the smallest specimens. We do have a pretty good diversity as well of turtles that are encountered, some in Hong Kong, but also more widely within Asia. Actually, the most diverse group in reptiles are lizards. And our collection has a good representation of some lizards that are found as well. You can see that here most of them are actually being preserved in some kind of liquid. So if some of the lizards that we've seen previously are actually quite small in their size, this is not the case of that monitor lizard that can reach a pretty respective size. Clearly, this is not the kind of lizard that you would like to bother during one of his meals or have it running right after you. So those actually used to be found in Hong Kong, but apparently they went extinct several decades ago. Hong Kong has a good diversity of snakes that can be encountered. The museum has also a good diversity of snakes that you can find behind me, and those range from fairly small ones to actually some pretty large ones or very dangerous ones, such as the cobra. So here we have amphibians, so frogs, toads, newts, and relative. And so you can see some of the specimens that we are keeping in the collection, including some very small specimens, as well as some pretty large toad that you might encounter, not just in Hong Kong, but also in other parts of the world. We actually have a very interesting specimen of a Chinese giant salamander. It's interesting, unfortunately, because this is becoming one of the rarest species in the world. And here we have a specimen that has been collected several decades ago. So it's a very precious one for our museum. In the central part of our museum, we do have marine life that are being presented. And here, just on my right, you actually have the collection of the corals that have been collected all over Asia, from the 1950s to the 1980s for most of the specimens that are being presented here. So here on my right and my left, we actually have creatures that compose the marine life. On my right here, I do have the crabs, which actually are quite diverse. We have about 100 specimens of crabs, which show a diversity of morphology, which correspond to the difference in their ecology that the different species can represent towards versus each other. On the left, I do have fishes, which I will be talking a little bit later. And then here we have the sea stars, which also are quite diverse in the shape, some being actually very thin, others much more robust. And then as we keep moving, we have more crustacean on this part with some shrimps, some mantis shrimps, some being very small, other quite large. And then we have some of the mollusks and bivalves being presented here on the left. One of the most popular groups of organisms in Hong Kong are the horseshoe crab. Obviously, you can see that they are very large, and so people can identify them quite easily. So we do have a few specimens here in the collection. And again, you can really see that this is a massive size for an invertebrate. So museums are important because they actually allow us to keep specimens and study their external morphology as well as their internal anatomy. And you can see here in that Nautilus that's been cut completely in half that you can see all the details of the shell as well as different parts of the body. So having this kind of specimen is very important for directly point on them where are the different body parts and understand how they actually relate to each other inside the body. So here we have a group of marine mollusks, and you can see that if some of them, like the one I'm carrying now, are actually quite modest in size, others can get much larger and have a diversity of shapes, colors, and that you can observe. The fish collection is one of the largest collections of specimens that we have within the museum. With nearly 300 specimens, the fish collection actually includes freshwater as well as marine fish. We have some small fishes and some much larger ones. Among them, and probably some among the favorite of the visitors and students, are the sharks. The sharks are definitely very interesting because they have an important ecological role, but also in the imaginary of many people, they both represent fear as well as some kind of respect. So sharks are predators, and as predators, that means that they will need to actually capture other prey so they can survive. Here we do have a jaw of sharks, and we can see all the many teeth that are on both sides of the jaw. So here, just to illustrate, the jaw should be actually folded. Now it's widely open for its preservation. One of the things that is interesting is that you can observe that there are teeth on the edges that you find on both sides. Those are actually very sharp, and also they are pointing towards the mouth. But one thing that is interesting is that you can see there are multiple layers of tooth that are within the jaw. Those are actually tooth that will come as the previous layer will actually fall down. So when the sharks are hitting, sometimes some of the tooth are actually being taken by the prey skin or in the bones, and they are falling off. But then the next layer of tooth will actually come up. So you can really see that motion here on that jaw, with some of the tooth almost going away while others are kind of coming up to actually be on the next layer. So just like I showed you earlier that we had a collection of skulls for mammals as well as for some reptiles, here we also have a similar collection for fishes. This is a bit less common, and you can see that actually you can really perceive a lot of differences in the skull, in the structure of the bone, how they are fused all together, but as well as the jaw and the different kind of teeth that different fishes can have. In this part here, we actually have another message that is very important for the museum. This is about conservation of species. Here we have a series of hippocampes, seahorses, that are very popular and famous. But unfortunately, many people attribute to them some properties, and they are heavily fished, and sometimes in all kinds of products for some property that they might have. So here we show them in their different stage, when they are kind of a natural preserve stage, as well as when they are dry or in some kind of powder. So this is actually the skull of a Napoleon fish. And here you can see this is actually a massive skull. Thus you have a massive fish. This one was actually donated to the museum recently by a professor who retired a few years ago. I really like it because you can see the complexity once again of all the different bone structure, how they are attached to each other, something that we don't necessarily expect from a fish. But actually here you can really look at it and look at all those different details of the tooth here, and then all those different plates that are connected, this different structure. And there's a lot of questions you can ask yourself about the fish and its life and how actually it evolved to such level of complexity. So here what we have are actually a series of teeth from elephants, and clearly those are much larger than our own teeth. So what I'm going to show you is actually one tooth that I'm holding here, and you can see it's pretty massive. I can tell you it's actually weighing quite a bit, and we have two main parts that we can recognize. Here on the top is a masticatory margin, so this is the part with which the elephant will actually get the food into the mouth and grind it. And then in the bottom part we have all the root system by which the tooth is actually inserted within the jaw. So that's a really impressive elements of the elephants that we can see. And here we have another one where you can see the masticatory margin here, and now this tooth has been completely cut in half, so we can see all the different layers within the tooth that are clearly visible. So again, this is quite heavy. So insects, spiders and millipedes and all the relative organisms compose a big group known as the arthropods. They're actually the most diverse group of organisms that we can find on the planet. Of course, the museum has to hold a good collection of the specimens from Hong Kong, but also from other parts of the world. Here behind me you can see some Coleoptera, the beetles that we have, but we also have the Lepidoptera. If we go further, we will have some of the Phasmatodea, the stick insects, and all those other fantastic groups of insects and other arthropods that we can find. Here we have different groups of arthropods, and I will start by the one here on the top, which are actually Myriapoda. And you might know them better with the term of millipedes or centipedes. So here we have a pretty large millipede. This one is not from Hong Kong, it's actually from Malaysia. But we do have actually specimens of centipedes, which here were collected in Hong Kong. So even in Hong Kong we can have some quite spectacular arthropods, which gets quite long for terrestrial arthropods. But some of my favorites are actually here. So for my personal research, I actually study ants. And here are some of the groups we can find with a nest of ant. So that was collected just a few years ago. And you can see that you have a regular branch, and on that branch you have this kind of ball that is actually an ant nest. And this is some kind of carton that the ants will actually produce themselves. So they will take some pulp of wood or other vegetables, chew it, and with that pulp they will actually build their nest, just like we will build a house. But what's really amazing, it's when you look inside. And here we just did cut it, so we can see all the different layers inside, and you can then see or reveal the complexity of this nest structure. So that's really something amazing, that ants, you can maybe see them, they're just on the tip here of those white little card. They're tiny, but they can build like huge structure relative to their size. So I find that's really something amazing, and part of what we are studying, and how ants or other insects are important in the ecosystem. Here's a part of a nest as well made by termites. So those are actually made in the soil, and this is just a tiny part, and this one comes from Namibia, so in southern Africa. We do have other nests, and another one that I really like in Hong Kong that are quite common, and this one is just a tiny nest. They can be much bigger than that. This is actually the nest of a weaver hen, and I found it right here on the campus of HKU when I was actually arriving one of the morning. And here you can see that single entrance by which the ants are actually coming in and out. So now you can think about, okay, what is that structure that we have here? Those are actually leaves that have been folded all together. And that white structure that you can see is actually silk. So how that nest has been made? Well, the ants will actually take the leaves together, form some chain with their own body, and bring the leaves slowly together. Then, as the leaves are actually close to each other, another ant will come, will carry a larvae, and the larvae will actually apply silk on the edge of the leaves. So the worker is actually carrying the larvae between its mandible and going back and forth with the larvae producing silk. And this is really sewing that the ants are doing, and this is very strong because I collected now this nest over 4 years ago, and you can see that the nest is just impeccable, just like the first day I found it. So truly amazing structure, but we're gonna see more. So here we actually have a nest of social wasp. This one is really huge, and I really love it for that reason. The size is really impressive. If we look inside, the nest has been open, and we can see layers after layers after layers. And those actually are the alveoles in which each larvae will hatch and then become a new adult. So the entire colony is living therein, and then they will be building again that carton-like structure that is very precise. I mean, you can see it's almost like an architect has been designing this. And you can see like some white parts that are actually emerging. Those are actually the parts that are left over from the larvae when it actually completes the nymphosis, so changing into an adult. And then you have a bit of that silk structure that remains. So we can look at that into more detail and try to understand again the complexity of this nest structure. I am myself an entomologist, so I'm actually very excited about that collection. And here the collection that you could see are actually specimens that were collected several decades ago, so way before even I was born. So one of the roles I've been playing now in the museum is actually to try to develop a new collection of arthropods, and in particular focusing on some of the arthropods and insects that are found in Hong Kong. So insects might not be as popular as many of the other groups of organisms we talked earlier. However, they are probably some of the most interesting and fascinating groups of organisms that you can think about, or even some aspects of their life that you are pretty far from considering. With over 1 million species described, and potentially as much as 4 other million species still undescribed to science, there is a lot of work that can be done on the research of insects. For that reason, museums play a key role at actually keeping collection of those insects to allow to find those new species, then having specimens that we can work on, describe, and then also observe a lot of very interesting morphological features, studying even the finest anatomical characteristic, difference in colors, for example, or how those coloration are being produced, aspects of the body size and some of the ratio of the length of different body structure. Here we can also observe some specimens with astonishing behavior. We do have some parasitoid wasps here that actually insert the eggs into the body of another insect. The eggs will actually hatch, develop as a larvae. The larvae will be eating the other organisms from the inside and then hatch finally as an adult. If you've seen the movie Alien, this is exactly what is happening every day in lives of insects.